this size of group, and we welcome you to the conversation. I think it's going to be an engaging and stimulating conversation, and we have entitled this webinar, Listening to a Movement, referring to the restorative justice movement, if you will. And this is going to be a conversation, but primarily we're going to be hearing from two of the key facilitators who went around the country to do some intensive listening to practitioners and other key thought leaders and writers, academics, authors, activists in the field of restorative justice. And we'll get into the logistics around that and all in just a moment. Sonya Shah is one of our guest presenters today, and she took the role of lead facilitator, and it was a real pleasure to work together with Sonya and Sarah. Sonya is an associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She's been facilitating restorative justice and trauma healing processes in her family, community, university, and in prison settings. She has over 20 years of experience in social justice education, and she currently facilitates groups for survivors of sexual harm and people who have committed sexual harm. And she's been doing some great work around that with Justice Beginnings Collaborative, a Justice Beginnings Collaborative called Project Ahimsa, which she started in 2015. She has trained hundreds of facilitators in trauma healing and restorative justice practices. She speaks regularly at conferences and has spoken on numerous locations and national radio programs, including NPR and the BBC, and has blogged on the Huffington Post. So it's a real pleasure to have you, Sonya, and thank you for being willing to come and talk about your experience with the Listening Project. Sarah then functioned with our team also as co-facilitating in the Minnesota site, as well as engaging in each of the sites with capturing the information and making sure that we were all hearing as much as we could from as many different voices as possible. Sarah King is currently a master's candidate here at Eastern Mennonite University at our Center for Justice and Peace Building. During her time at CJP, Sarah has been employed as the graduate assistant and then the Restorative Justice Project assistant right here at the Zehr Institute. And it's been a pleasure to have her gifts and skills in the Zehr Institute. In the latter role, Sarah's primary responsibility has been assisting with the Restorative Justice Listening Project, which is what she'll be talking about with Sonya in a moment. Prior to attending CJP, Sarah was a staff member of the Victim Assistance Program and Restorative Justice Unit at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she will complete her graduate studies in April 2017. And Sarah comes with a lot of experience working in Minnesota and with the government ministry around issues of restorative justice and victim empowerment. So it's a real pleasure to have both of them. And we're going to turn, we're going to move into the next part of the presentation. Let me just remind you, as we're presenting, which we'll do in the next half hour or so, there'll be presentation time. As you are thinking of questions that you might have, please feel free to go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your questions in. And we'll be monitoring those, and we'll leave at least 25 minutes at the end of the webinar for us to field some of your questions, and in that way hear some good feedback and your voice in this important issue. So I'm going to start off with just a few opening remarks to sort of give you a backdrop to this listening project and what our goals were. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sonya and Sarah to really give us the core of the work that they have been involved with over the last few months. So for us in the Zehr Institute, this whole process has been a 3 to 4 year engagement, if you will. 3 years ago, we engaged the Porticus Foundation, and they engaged us, and together we worked on a process of dreaming about what it would be to try to engage all those who have been coalescing around restorative justice in different ways to begin to ask the question, is restorative justice more than just a social service, which it has often been portrayed as especially by the institution of criminal justice and so on, or in social work, and so that this is an add-on social service of sorts. Many of us who've been engaging in this for decades and years, and other groups that have maybe engaging in this and not even calling it restorative justice in some situations, have felt like restorative justice is more than a social service. It's a worldview, it's a lifestyle, it's a particular way of being and doing. And so what we've seen in the last 2 years is a tremendous increase in research, in practice and application around the restorative justice and its ability not only to transform individuals, but to transform structures. And so what we designed is we had a consultation of leaders in the field in 2015 in the summer. 36 leaders came together, and we workshopped a highly facilitated process looking at transformative scenario building. And there's a report that came out of that project, and we'd be happy to share that with anyone who's interested. In 2016, then we had a public conference building on that consultation, where we tried to look at this very issue of what does restorative justice look like, and if it is a social movement of sorts or a new framework for transforming structural harms and structural violence, then what would that look like, and who needs to be networked, and who needs to be in conversation with each other. The third year, which we're in right now, there's a writing project that's involving a smaller group of people with the hope of some publications that will work around these issues that I have framed here. And then finally, this is the backdrop to what we moved into this listening project, where we decided we needed to go to the regions and locations where we could get together a great diversity of voices to actually listen carefully to how they see restorative justice being utilized, and whether they can see and capture a vision of restorative justice, or what is their vision of restorative justice in the future. And this concept of movement building was central to that. Our intended outcomes in this listening project were to engage the wisdom and experience of thought leaders and local practitioners, as I mentioned already, of restorative justice, to understand the landscape of the restorative justice movement. We had a sense that there was this new energy, this pulse, this movement, and we wanted to say, if that's the case, can we have intentional conversation about it and intentionally accompany each other, building coalitions, and see if there's a way in which we can undergird this movement more intentionally. We also wanted to examine successes and challenges that are area specific and identify issues that are movement specific. So we felt like we had a sense that there was cross-cutting themes that we would find that would sort of identify this restorative justice process as a movement, not just a social service that would be is similar from one place to the next. We also were fully aware that part of the reason why restorative justice is effective is it is a frame that allows us to contextualize it quite significantly. And so we knew there were specific contextual practices that were really important to learn from, but not necessarily could be replicated elsewhere. Fourthly, we wanted to provide a cadre of restorative justice funders, which are starting to gather with an understanding of the impact and direction of this restorative justice movement as we see it. And these funders are folks who are looking into funding into the future, and it seemed that they're willing to engage in a different kind of funding conversation, one that was more looking at systems change, one that was looking at long-term funding and breaking some of the bureaucratic and systematic sort of hierarchy of the funding world, particularly as it comes to 1 year, 3 year cycles of funding that many times are imposing on projects as opposed to allowing movements to grow. And finally, or the last two, we wanted to offer direction and recommendations that emerge from these local social contexts, people, and history from this listening project, and reflect back then to the restorative justice movement builders and practitioners our own strengths and all of our own strengths and challenges, opportunities, and areas of growth. So these were our intended outcomes from this, and we'll talk about how we tried to move in the direction of accomplishing these and what we're hearing. And this is a project on the way. And so with those comments, I think I'm going to turn it over and let Sonya and Sarah take it from here. Sarah will be next, I believe, to give us a little bit more detail and background to the project as it unfolded. Sarah?
Yes. Hi. So technical difficulty. I can't see any of you or control anything when I have the full screen up. So we are going to just do a little bit of this. And let's see. Does that look okay? I can zoom out. Well, no. Okay. Is this okay? People generally like feeling okay about this? Okay.
Yeah, that looks fine.
Okay, give a shout out to anyone if they can't see it very well. I will just speak for about 5 or 10 minutes or so about just giving you an overview of the locations I went to. So first, we were really trying to hear from a diverse cross-section of folks doing restorative justice and peacemaking work across the US and then also in Canada. And we pulled this together through the networks of folks that we already knew. So there are some limitations to that, but we were trying to identify hubs of restorative justice in these places. So we came up with Minnesota, Maryland, British Columbia, the Bay Area in California, and then with the Navajo Nation, New Mexico. So through those 5 sites, we were able to gather with 120 participants. Not all of them were restorative justice practitioners, but most of them were, or their work intersected with RJ in some way. Which kind of accumulated to about 1,018 plus years of experience or practice wisdom, which I think is really, getting to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of hearing from as many voices as possible, but the depth and the breadth of what we're doing. So Sonya designed the facilitation, and we had a template that was used at each of the sessions, but each of the sessions were tailored to each site, I would say. And Sonya will talk more about that later. But we had some large group processes where people could do some community building and reflecting back with each other. We had breakouts in the morning around strengths, barriers, connectors, and dividers. And then also breakouts in the afternoon around sustainable funding, coalition building, and movement building, or other. So sites, especially there, could kind of pick their own topics, show up to whichever group they felt like they needed to speak to or wanted to. And sometimes there was one person in the group, and that's okay too. We just collected all the information that we could. And so it was interesting to see what people were drawn to. And then we also did a participant survey. We had a 77% response rate overall. And I will talk more about that in just a second, and what some of those preliminary findings are. So this was just kind of the basic template of how the listening sessions, what the process was at each of the sessions. Okay, so we started this whirlwind tour with Minnesota. So just to preface, we started the planning of this in late November, early December, with the end goal of having things kind of wrapped up in April and May. So we had a pretty quick turnaround. So we started with Minnesota in late February. There was up to 24 inches of snow forecasted, which thankfully did not fall. But that was a good scare for a second there. I helped co-facilitate that one. And as Carl mentioned previously, Sonya just was lead facilitator for all of these sessions. And so we had about 20 folks, and the vast majority of people in the room were practitioners themselves. And we were really trying to capture both the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul practitioners, but also folks who were doing work out in rural areas in Minnesota. And that was, I think Minnesota was the site that kind of had probably the biggest concentration of rural voices. So that was good. I'm glad that was able to take place and people were able to make it. Maryland, we turned around, and 2 days later we were in Maryland doing that facilitation. Lauren Abramson was the co-facilitator there, and she is the founder and co-executive director of the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore. And so there we had a really interesting mix of folks. Most of the people were either community-based or systems-based, and Lauren did a fantastic job of finding a lot of different practitioners to come and speak and share. And so it was a very interesting mix of folks. And yeah, we'll just keep going right along. We had British Columbia then in March. And Catherine Bargan was the co-facilitator there. She's the community program manager and Restorative Justice Coordinator with the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General in British Columbia in Vancouver. And that site, we had the most attendees there. The room was packed. It was fantastic. We had a lot of community and systems-based folks, and at least 4 women who were coming from First Nations communities that offered a really unique perspective on the work that they do in their local communities. And then we also went to the Bay Area in California, March 22nd. Ashley George was the co-facilitator there, and she is the Senior Program Associate with the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice in Oakland. And I would say the Bay Area, that was a fantastic listening session as well. Definitely, I would say the most culturally diverse of all the listening sessions, and that was a wealth of knowledge and perspective, and just overall goodness that came out of that session that we'll speak to more later. And then let's see here. We've got the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. We ended March with that site. It was in Crown Point, and the local co-facilitator there was Chief Justice Robert Yazzie. So he's a professor at the Navajo Technical University and a retired Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation. And so that session was was a bit different than the other listening sessions. We designed the questions differently, and there were, I think, maybe 3 non-Navajo people in the room. Otherwise, it was a fantastic gathering. There was most of it was spoken in Dene, their language in the Navajo Nation, and so that presented its own challenges, but also a really amazing experience to be able to be a part of that. But Justice Yazzie was able to pull together a wide variety of people working in peacemaking in the Navajo Nation, and also for folks working in the legal system and with human rights and schools and all sorts of different intersections with their peacemaking traditions. So that was a very valuable experience. And then we had our final convening, which was not technically a listening session. It was more of a kind of working group dialogue facilitation. And so we had 17 folks there. Carl, Sonya, and I kind of all helped co-facilitate that one. And that was just about 2 weeks ago in Virginia. So that's a brief overview of the places we went and the people that we met with. So the participant survey I'll touch on just a bit. And really, there's a lot of information that we're still sifting through. And so one of the points of the survey was to kind of just get a general mapping of what people were doing and where. So we did ask that specific question, but then we also provided people a chance to just circle words or add others of how they describe their practices. And so I put these into categories, as you can see in the bold letters, of how I named them. That might, like I said, it's preliminary. So we might change those titles, but this was a grouping that made sense to me in terms of where are people doing the work, like where are they positioned within the conversation? Are they working with specific groups of people based upon identity or age? Are they working in a different discipline and intersecting with RJ or in collaboration with, or whatever that looks like? Are they working on specific topics within their RJ practice? And then are they working with, I didn't have a great name except for locations, but just like, are they working in schools, in the universities? Are they working in corrections, locations? So on that note, we do have all this data compiled for the sites individually, and they do differ. But then I put all of it together for all the sites. So this is what it looks like for everybody combined. So overall, most of the folks were saying that they're doing community-based work, that they're working with youth. And then all 3 of these, which I guess isn't too surprising, but the K through 12 schools, the criminal legal system, and then diversion of any form. So both schools and criminal legal diversion are the top 3 ranking locations in which people are doing this work in these particular sessions. And then in terms of topic, trauma healing was the one with the highest responses. And then we've got social justice, racial justice, and workplace conflict. And then intersecting disciplines, victim and survivor services, community organizing was next. And so it's just interesting also to see, like environmental justice, some folks are doing that, but a lot aren't. And what does that conversation look like? I mean, I think, some of this data is pointing to our strengths and also where some gaps might be or some learning edges. So we also collected some data around funding. So like, what are your main sources of funding? So Like I said, this is preliminary. I was counting up things earlier this week. So we have fee-for-service, government, foundation, donations, and nonprofits. Government is overwhelmingly the majority, might be slightly skewed because British Columbia, a lot of their funding comes from government. And so I think there's more to unpack here and learn. And then also the average cycle of funding, overwhelmingly the majority of people had annual or one-year funding structures. But we can probably sift through if that's like guaranteed budget, like line item, or if it's grants and things like that. So that's what we were looking at for that. And now I'll pass it on to Sonya.
All right. Hey, everyone. Excited to be here. If you can't hear me, just say something. And I think I'm going to take you through kind of more of the emerging themes that came out of these listening sessions. But I want to start by saying, just to say something about my own little positionality here. I'm in the Bay Area. I'm a South Asian woman, an immigrant, came from India, settled in New York, moved to the Bay Area. And for me, I do sort of restorative-based trauma healing, criminal justice reform, structural oppression work in many different realms in all of my circles, from my family to my community to different contexts. And I think it's important for me to say that starting out, because I don't see any of this work being outside of just who I am and what I do. So I wanted to say that. I also wanted to say that this is in no way representative of what everybody is doing in RJ. I don't think we could do that ever. This is a cross-section representation. So, when we get a slice of the pie, what does it tell us just about who we are and what we're doing? And I think doing this sort of project, I will say that both Sarah and I felt a tremendous amount of carrying a weight of responsibility to listen and hear all these amazing things and all this wisdom of what people are doing, and then try to turn it around, integrate it, create some themes, and make some meaning out of it. And so this is our sort of humble attempt at some meaning making that will continue to grow and evolve and has many iterations. So the first thing I want to jump into is just this notion, and that really helped me actually as we were doing this project along the way, as we were doing this listening, is to see that there are really different distinct locations of restorative justice practices, peacemaking. And I'm going to say something about the terminology in a minute. But that if we try to see it all as one thing, I think that's where we get very confused about, like, what are the definitions and what's the language we use. And I think if we look at them, and what I saw is seeing the difference between Indigenous and Aboriginal practices, community-based restorative justice practices and peacemaking, and people that are working or pushing up against the justice system and institutions. And they're very, very different. And in a way, the location, if we really think about our context, our history, our community as a driving force, and we start from there, that really defines what RJ is for us, what language use we use, the strengths and challenges, and it all flows out of there. So that was very helpful for me in this process of really trying to tease that apart, and maybe it could be helpful moving forward. I think another piece that came out of it, is just the sense of, in 2017, the question that I would ask coming out of this project is, how big is the restorative justice and peacemaking and restorative practices tent? How big do we want it to be, right? So what is our starting point when we talk about restorative justice? Do we start by talking about Indigenous paradigms of circle and peacemaking? Do we start by talking about Howard Zehr's kind of interruption in the criminal legal system and those three questions? Where do we start? Do we look at the desire and kind of more of the culture in the schools to really think about it as restorative practices and not necessarily harm oriented? And at this point, a lot of it is all meshed together, where if you look at a lot of restorative community conferences, they're using circle process that's New Zealand style, right? So I think it's a question we need to ask ourselves is, are we willing to make the tent really big? I'm not sure we're all on the same page all the time about what that tent looks like, but what is the tent that we're really talking about? And how big can we make it? And I'm hoping that we make it really big, and that it includes Indigenous paradigms of circle and healing, restorative practices, and also restorative justice. So that I'm going to kind of talk from there. So So just kind of going on to, I want to start with talking a little bit about the indigenous paradigm that kind of came out through the listening sessions. That's totally fine, Sarah. The slide is not, there's no slide for it. Because we did do a session in the Navajo Nation that was really led by Chief Justice Yazzie. And there were 4 women who came from British Columbia who were Aboriginal restorative and traditional justice healers and justice practitioners. And I think one is actually on the line, Faith Trade. So we're really glad you're there. And I want to say that what was very unique about the indigenous paradigm was that it was highly relational, and it was really kind of obvious in the Navajo Nation that RJ is embedded in a bigger sense of a way of life and a life way. So that traditional law, natural law, is not separate from restorative justice and the fundamental law of the Dene. And that one of the most important pieces in the Navajo Nation listening session is the sense that what really needs to happen is a Dene and cultural revival, right? A sense of knowing oneself, knowing one's traditions and one's cultural context. And that cannot be separated from, and it is intrinsically linked to restorative practices. So much so that there were a number of stories that were told about how knowing your relations and your relationships actually reduces recidivism. There was a peacemaker who spoke about when folks come to her that are coming to her after they have created a harm, the first thing that she does is start to name the kinship and clanship. And in naming kinship and clanship, there's a sense of responsibility that starts to happen to community. Once a sense of responsibility starts to happen, then recidivism drops. And that peacemaker's name was Elaine Henderson. There was another story that was told by a gentleman who was working in schools, in peacemaking, a school that was trying to be a peacemaking K through 12 school. And he said, you know, sometimes there's a fight on the yard, and we go out on the yard and say to the kids, hey, you know, isn't that your brother? Isn't that the kid that you're fighting? Isn't he your relative? And when the kids kind of have some recognition that they might be fighting with their relative, it sort of decreases the harm, right? So the sense of that sense of relationship was a big piece in the Navajo Nation listening session, as well as how the fundamental law of the Dene really has to be a part of all aspects of really increasing kind of the work that's happening in the Navajo Nation. To dovetail off of that, just to mention in British Columbia with, there were Joan of the Stolo Nation, Mary Brown of the Heiltsuk Nation, Faith Trait of the Nigsa Nation, and there was one other person, Rosemary, came. And they shared really deeply about the notion of RJ as a holistic healing paradigm, right? Not as, and what Joan said is, we don't all agree on the outcomes of restorative justice. First Nations people want holistic healing. Other people, she was referring to urban restorative justice practitioners, want restitution. So we have different outcomes. First Nations people are looking to heal versus you broke a window and have to repair the harm. So what's the sense of really like what the healing looks like? Faith, who's on the line, said this really beautiful thing, Faith, that I've repeated many times, that there was no such word in their own tradition for offender, that the word that they use is unhealed. And actually, when she said that in the room, all of us sighed and kind of our jaws dropped. And Claire, who I think is also on the line from the Public Safety Ministry, said, what if this was the framework that we use to think about people? And what if all of the justice frameworks and repairing harm frameworks really came from that notion of being unhealed? Another piece that really came from that paradigm was the sense, again, from Faith about starting from our own relationships, the strength of our self-connection and our own relationships. So one of the things she said was we have to start from the strength of our relationships, about our own self-awareness from ourselves, which then shapes health and wellness. We have to understand our own layers of trauma and do our own work. If an unhealed person is facilitating, what are they passing on? You can't reach out to be a connector if you're not connected to yourself, right? So what's this notion of how we actually do the work in restorative justice, restorative practices, if we're not healing ourselves? How do we actually heal others, or work in assisting the healing of others if we're just passing on trauma? So that on the Indigenous lens. The next slide is about restorative justice as a movement and intersection with other movements. So there were some sort of major themes that came up around RJ as a movement. You know, restorative justice as a social movement itself, restorative justice as it intersects with other social justice movements, and then just the notion of the commitment within the restorative justice practices peacemaking community to anti-racism and intersectionality, and framing intersectionality as central to the work that we actually need to do with each other. Not anybody else, but with each other as a community of practitioners, of academics, activists, etc. And, you know, I noticed there's some other Bay Area people on the line, and Kamisha and Michael and Ashley and some other folks were there. So I hope eventually you'll chime in. But so I'll start out by saying something that came out in the Bay Area, and maybe easy for me to talk about because I'm located here, is that RJ is very much embedded within social justice practices here in the Bay Area. There were 22 out of the 26 people in the room were people of color that are deeply engaged in other kinds of movement building, intersections with racial justice, youth justice, ending mass incarceration, sexual and domestic violence, historical harms, so many different kinds of social justice, criminal justice reform movements that, and I think a lot of folks here kind of live that. So there wasn't so much of a question about separating out, like, is this social justice or is this restorative justice? It was sort of like, well, this is kind of what we do, you know, and we're using a restorative justice frame. Using it in trying to lead systems shifting, some of the work that Impact Justice is doing, leading it in terms of restorganizing, a term that was coined by Arjoy, naming historical and structural impact. I think I know David Newsom is also on the line. There's kind of some really amazing work that Oakland Unified School District is trying to do, and the magnitude that they're trying to do to work with restorative justice practices in a school system that has 20 RJ coordinators. So there's a lot of sort of innovation, I think, happening in the Bay Area. The other questions about restorative justice in relationship to social movement really came out, how do we see its relationship to social movements, really came out in British Columbia, in Minnesota, and in Maryland quite a bit. And there was a Christian in British Columbia that said something very beautiful about how social justice comes from a deep, deep need, a sense of oppression and struggle, and identity-based. And she said, anti-oppression comes about at the intersection of all the different movements, and a recognition that what intersectionality is. Social justice movements are deeply rooted in identity and culture. In RJ, we talk about things in terms of victim and the harm and offender and what they've done. We in RJ use equality a lot, meaning everyone is equal in a circle. And oppression, it's equity. Difference of recognition that everyone needs different things to succeed. How will RJ processes provide equity as well? How will they provide both opportunity to victims and offender and that label, but shed those and really work towards a sense of identity? So that was a big theme, right? The sense of what is the social justice movements coming out of struggle, coming out of identity and culture, RJ coming out of sort of a set of practices. There was a lot of agreement that RJ could be a really useful tool to lend to other social justice movements that don't have a tool to work around conflict and harm. At the same time, and this came out as well, is that if RJ practitioners aren't really steeped in understanding historical impact, anti-oppression, intersectionality, structural harm, how can they really be helpful to social justice movements if they don't really understand that lens? So those were some of the dialogues that kind of came out of this. I think one of the things that both really got brought up in Minnesota and also in British Columbia is this notion of wanting to do anti-racism and anti-racism circles in our own restorative justice community, and really make a commitment to that within our own community. So tensions and scaling up, I'm moving down to D, and I'm going to just talk for about 5 more minutes, and I think we want to make sure that there's enough time for Q&A. So I'll talk about D and then maybe just really quickly work through the rest. This became a big issue, this notion of scaling up and integrity of practice, right? We all kind of know we're getting bigger, and there's a lot of worry. What does it mean to get bigger? What does it mean to do a good job when we get bigger? And what does it mean to stay true to a kind of a wisdom that is birthed out of kind of community and about a direct wisdom experience, and not necessarily be based on certification, right? So, you know, this notion came up in Baltimore, and maybe I would just call it like different pillars of wisdom. And what is wisdom? What makes a good practitioner? And if we break that down, one of the things that came up in this small group is that people that are in community, there's community wisdom. You're from that community. You're a directly impacted person. You have direct experience of something. That brings you wisdom. You actually have some skill. You've done some training. You have some aptitude. That's a kind of wisdom. And what is your capacity? Not everybody's a great facilitator, and we kind of need to say that out loud a little bit more, right? What is your capacity to track, to hold space, to understand trauma, all that kind of stuff. So if we look at community wisdom, direct experience wisdom, aptitude, skill wisdom, and capacity wisdom, perhaps those are more useful ways to thinking about what makes a good practitioner and having integrity of practice, right? This came up in so many different ways. British Columbia is doing a project around trying to create standards that aren't, and you know, even when they said that word, it was said very tentatively, like not trying to be something that we prescribe that everybody does, but what are a set of guidelines that folks can ascribe to? Can we come up with those sets of guidelines? Like I said, again, in Baltimore, this was sort of what was mentioned. And in the Bay Area, there was a beautiful list that got created in some of the small groups about naming the tensions between these things, these sides. So, right, so how do we as practitioners have humility and self-reflection and at the same time have confidence as circle keepers? How do we have fidelity to basic principles and practices and at the same time have fluidity and adaptability? How do we make sure that we're in circle before we keep circle? How do we allow ourselves freedom to fail but not allow ourselves off of the hook? How do we avoid co-opting and colonizing indigenous practices and at the same time honoring indigenous roots? How are we sufficiently excellent at training without certifying? How are we, you know, all these things, fundability versus realness. How do we really empower youth leadership and at the same time let kids be kids, right? How do we make these things affordable, particularly trainings affordable, because folks in community can't afford to take a lot of the trainings that usually the demographic are people that can pay, that are white or, you know, or relatively privileged middle class folks. So those were some of the big things that came up around the tensions and scaling up, and I think that's going to be a big theme moving forward. And then just to mention the tension with systems partners, right? This notion that restorative justice is seen as a quick fix versus restorative justice as a paradigm shift, right? And it came out a lot in talking about Oakland Unified School District. There was a conversation about how with one of the brothers that was in the room that he was saying, you know, classroom teachers often want us to just come in and fix everything that's broken in their classroom because they have bad classroom management skills, right? So teachers looking to RJ as being this quick fix to fix my bad classroom strategies, as opposed to being something that's really a paradigm shift. And how do you as a practitioner really push up against that, push back on that, and really insist on the paradigm shift? How hard it is to insist on the paradigm shift when you're working in big systems. David Usam mentioned one of the things that's really important, and the critical actors are the teacher leaders that really get RJ, that really get RJ and will do it no matter what. So who are those people? Who are those teacher leaders and social workers and all those folks that are actually working in the system, that are pushing up against the system, that really understand RJ as not a quick fix? So those are some things I would say there. And then I'll just really quickly touch on the next slide. Just real quick, you know, I would say that everybody, you know, 135 people in all the sessions really understand that we want to live our values. You know, we want to walk our talk and we want to live it from the micro to the macro level. We're not always doing it, but we're really committed to doing that. And that was just a beautiful thing to see, how much sort of deep sensitivity there was to living the values of being in relationship and community in restorative values. This sense of connection to self and self-awareness and self-healing as a starting point. And then just want to mention the emerging theme of bottom-up organizing, right? The sense of collective and collaborative approaches. One of the pieces in British Columbia that was named was that there's an Aboriginal justice kind of strand, and they work very closely with the Canadian government to be more of a bottom-up kind of strategy to really fund and resource Aboriginal justice traditions. Can we be doing that more with restorative justice, no matter what funding partners or resource partners or government we're working with? And how do we become strong in creating very inclusive bottom-up structures that are decentralized in terms of power in order to do that? So maybe let's just go to the next slide. And I will say, kind of moving into our final convening, that was one of the things Carl, Sarah, and I kind of came with was a sense of would it, you know, would we, do we want to be more intentional about having a kind of network or a hub structure that's decentralized, again, has some centrality, but is decentralized, that's incredibly inclusive and bottom up, right, as much as possible. And I say that in a way to then try to drive, to be the people in the driver's seat, hopefully driving what we want and what we need, as opposed to being driven as much by resources, even though we are stuck in capitalism and modernity, so we will be driven by that, right? But do we want to do that? Do we have, you know, a sense of wanting to do that? One of the things that I noticed in the final convening is that a couple things, I mean, I think in our final sort of gathering, which was just, you know, kind of a working group conversation, is that people have a different relationship to structure and what structure means in terms of power and inclusivity. And so it seems really, really important that we break down a sense that structure doesn't mean kicking people out. It means just being able to organize in a thoughtful way. That also maybe because we're historically not used to, as a RJ community, making decisions, holding power, driving decision-making, it can be difficult to step into that place to say what is really, really important. What are strategies? You know, what are things that we say we don't want to leave behind and we want to fund and we want to resource? And can we put ourselves behind those things? So, you know, that's kind of where we left it. And again, I think with everybody on the line, this is an iterative process. We are listening to movements, we're building a movement, we're in the movement, and we'll see where it goes. And then the last piece was there were some breakouts around sustainable funding. And you know, the only thing I would say about that is there were a couple of really interesting points. One was this notion that resources will often go where coalitions and movements are. And that came from some funders that were in the room. The second thing was around, they came up in a bunch of places in Minnesota and the Bay Area that we don't tell very good origin stories, and that we could probably do a better job of messaging, of really like telling the story of the work that we do, of the way that we are trying to live. And what I'd like to put out there is also just not being siloed from funding communities and having more inclusivity of the funding community within the conversation itself. And so we did in the room, in some of the gatherings, have some people from funding communities there. There's so much more, but those were the big, big emerging themes. So thank you. I think I'm turning it back to Carl, correct?
Yeah, yep. And then this is just the acknowledgement sheet of everyone who participated in the listing sessions, and then yeah, so some really fantastic folks, and hopefully I included everybody alphabetically. Yes, lots of folks, so it's all good. But I will stop sharing my screen now, and there we go.
Thank you, Sonia and Sarah. That was fantastic. And yes, as you can probably tell, those who have been in this conversation, we're still processing a great deal of information. And the last gathering that we had, where we brought together folks to look at some of this, was just 2 weeks ago. And so we're still in the process of trying to put the information together, report on it, look at, categorize it, try to digest a little bit more in our conversation. So let me just open up the lines to say, please send questions, comments. We've had a few, and I think it might be nice to jump in on some of the questions we've been hearing, but I would welcome more, please. As you're seeing the kind of content that's coming out here. I'm imagining you have lots of questions coming from behind it, because this has been very much of a theme, you know, broad strokes of what we're hearing. Some of it might be surprising, some of it might not be. All of it has significance as to how we imagine this field that I think we all care deeply about, whatever you call it, field, discipline, movement, service, this restorative work about. And so would love to hear from you. Please send questions in. There was one question about commenting on funding a little bit more, and I wish I could get the voice of some of those resources that are right here in this webinar with us to be able to speak. Unfortunately, technology is blocking that a bit, but I would welcome anyone to make comments on funding experiences they have, especially new funding. But let me just read one of the comments. In any of the sessions, one of the questions that came from someone who's also been involved with funding, they were curious how many funders were in our listening sessions, and how many, and what did we hear from them about new ideas for funding. Additionally, was there any in-depth conversation about how to educate RJ practitioners on how to tap into larger funding streams? So I don't know, Sonya and Sarah, if you'd like to comment a little bit more on what we think what we're starting to hear from funders in the sense of new ways of thinking and doing this funding thing that might complement some of the direction we're taking with what we've heard in the listening project. Any comments from what sticks out to you in those listening processes?
I can, well, maybe not a complete answer at all, but I took notes in the breakout session on funding in Baltimore, and there were at least 3 of the people at the table were funders themselves, and I think most of them had more questions than answers, and they really wanted to hear from the practitioners in the room. I think I'm not sure how many funders were in the room in British Columbia. In Oakland, I think there were probably 3 or 4, maybe Sonya can clarify that. The Navajo Nation, I don't think there were any. And then we had 2 at our final convening. So I guess I wasn't part of the conversation in Oakland around the sustainable funding, so Sonya might have more to say about that. But yeah, I think, anyways, long story short, the funders were very engaged and wanted to hear from the people doing the work about how to best support them, and then what that looks like, which is some of the data that we were gathering through the survey. But Sonya, want to chime in on that one?
Sure, yeah. And Kamisha Fatima is asking this question, and she was at the Bay Area one. I feel like I keep naming people because it's important. So I wasn't sitting, I also didn't sit in any of the small group sessions on strategic funding, but there were some really interesting ideas that came out. We had note takers in every session. Sarah and I took notes. Some of the things in Baltimore that came out were this notion of like having speed dating. So funders and programs could come together to discuss program and funding and get to know each other that way. Having a line in RFPs about restorative work. So, and also a line item in budgets, right? I think this came out in the Bay Area also as the sense of moving towards big state budgets, trying to have restorative justice line items. There was other stuff around sharing space. There's a lot of duplicative cost for personnel, accounting, IT lawyers. So this notion of also, can we get more collaborative so that our fundings, you know, our sort of resources are not being duplicitous. That was some of the stuff in Baltimore. In the Bay Area, the notes that I have, I'm looking at them right now, were, you know, and you were there as well, it was a sense of really making sure that there's equitable partnership, that when you have grassroots organizations partnering with bigger organizations, that there's really a sense of equity. And I think that's on us. That's on us as nonprofits, you know, not to fall into the nonprofit industrial complex way of being, and make sure we're doing right by each other. This notion that money following movements and coalitions, right? So the more that we're building, the more that we might sort of really building intentionally, the more resource there's possibly to be had. I get the sense, you know, the funders that I know, they're people, they're in it for the good work. They want to see it succeed, right? So one of the funders in the Bay Area said, she said this beautiful thing that that there's this way that, people sometimes tell great stories, and there are people out there that tell great stories, but their work isn't that good. There are organizations out there that do great work, but don't know how to tell a story, so they don't get funded. And then there's folks that do both. They tell good stories and they do good work. And so I would take that as an interesting sort of thought moving forward. How do we do great work and tell good stories, right, of the work that we do? I think one of the things, a part of this process, is we're trying to just have more relationship with funders to say this is the work that's happening without being gatekeepers and naming anybody specifically, just saying here are the issues, here's what folks are working on in different places, here's what needs to be funded. Sarah, Carl, and I, and people in that last convening, really felt strongly about not leaving Indigenous folks behind, right? We point to them so often as the starting point of peacemaking and circles. And what does it mean that they're not getting as much resource as other people in cities, right? So do we have some commitment as a community of restorative justice practices, peacemaking folks, to not leave Indigenous folks behind, and to say that that is actually a priority in a funding strategy, right? I'm saying that as an example. Would another example be, how do we really tackle this issue of practice and good practice and integrity of practice and wisdom and what makes good practice? If we're scaling up, right? What does that really look like? What does that mean? What do we need? How do we do it in a way that we're not dishonoring anyone in the community or with direct lived experience, but actually honoring their wisdom? So these are things that can then really break down into strategies, right? And then those things can break down into, so that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think we're getting, in broadest sense of the word, we're getting some sense that there's some restlessness in the funding community, which is good, and a sense of looking for new and creative ways of funding. And as Sonya said, the funding will follow our work and the movement, and that's a challenge, to not be waiting to sort of go to the funders, but that the work to go forward and be so enticing that we're inviting new ways of funding in that process. But we're certainly hearing new questions being asked by funders, like how can we think about systems impact, and what does that mean for long-term funding? What would that look like, and how can we look at new structures? I think those of us who've been in the field long enough remember the time when the funders began to demand that we build coalitions, but we didn't want to at the time, often because we were still working in separate projects. But it's very clear from research and from the whole advancement of the field that if we remain at sort of just funding separate projects and programs and nonprofit organizations, it will remain that scattered and not nearly as impactful as we would like to imagine if we think about coalitions and networks of practice going forward. Wonderful. I'm just looking at some folks are starting to come in with comments and questions. Thank you. Keep them coming. Faith Tate asked, just add, when working with Aboriginal, we focus on how we fit process into the culture, not how culture fits the process. Lovely, lovely comment there. And I don't know if Sonya or Sarah want to comment on that and their experience in working particularly with within New Mexico and with the Navajo Nation.
I think Faith is from British Columbia, and thank you, Faith, because you're in our thoughts, and I think the notion that you bring around being healing centered and really that holistic healing paradigm, and just what you have to say, you have so much to teach the rest of us. So if you have any more comments to add, please just keep writing them down. Thank you.
So we have another comment here coming out of Baltimore City. Katrina Brooks, thank you. She says, Baltimore City Public Schools have made a 5-year commitment to restorative practices starting in the upcoming 2017-2018 school year. Open Society Institute Baltimore chapter has committed to funding the launch and implementation. Principal, teachers, school administration, and community stakeholders are being trained. City Schools has created a new Office of Restorative Practices This summer, there will be a summer institute to train 120 students from 6 high schools in Baltimore to make sure students are trained and able to practice in class and at home. And then she says the Summer Institute was created by Johns Hopkins University Center for Adolescent Health and will support the Institute in partnership with city schools. Baltimore Mayor's Office, Open Society Institute, and the Family League of Baltimore, along with other funders. Katrina, thank you. This is, I think, giving us a bit of a mini case study on some of the work that's being done in Baltimore and its creativity. And one thing that I want to comment on is I'm particularly happy that we're focusing on a whole school approach and also training the students themselves, because I think what we often imagine, even with restorative justice, is that it's going to come from the top down. And I think we need to begin to build the capacity of students. And we know that in places like Oakland, where it's been very successful, the students have worked very effectively in their levels of influence all the way up to where they meet with others in the system, in the hierarchical system of the school. And so we sort of need that bottom-up, bottom-down approach. And I would commend that in this situation. Sonya, Sarah, any comments on that around the schools?
Yeah, I want to add 2 things because I see them on the strand here. David Usum added, and my bad, quick clarification that OUSD has 33 sites, based RJ staff and 4 program managers and 1 RJ program coordinator. And Michael Hatcher has a question here that I think also relates to this. He was also in the Bay Area of, are there any examples of our restorative practices being taken up by people who have the most direct contact, for example, teachers, probation officers, or police, right? I think this whole piece around systems and institutions is a big territory. I feel like, you know, it felt like when we were in the room, we didn't get into as much of a conversation about how do we really, really directly work with and work up against and work in systems and institutions. To Michael's question, I don't know of probation officers or police directly saying, I'm going to start and do RJ, but maybe you guys do know that a little bit more. I see more people kind of being interested and particularly working around the trauma healing lens. I'm working with some law enforcement folks around that. But then I also think about it as like, we're all people, right? And a lot of this is birthed out of one's own desire to kind of do something around addressing harm that's different from necessarily the roles that we're in. So, I mean, I know in the Bay Area, one of the things we talk a lot about is just this community, the notion of doing RJ in community. It's not even about, you know, having some person in authority be the person facilitating, right? And that even, I mean, Malachi mentioned this in the Bay Area, that even when we have a facilitator, there's a sense of a power differential. You know, shouldn't we just be training each other and ourselves to kind of just do this within our practices? And it's definitely the way that I'm trying to work around sexual harm and domestic, more on sexual harm, is it's not really about me facilitating a process, it's about embedding a process in dealing with sexual harm in families where families have capacity to talk about stuff in themselves. And so, yeah, I feel like this is a really, really big question in terms of how we engage and what's happening around the country in terms of engagement with law enforcement, with schools and school districts. And I'm sure there are some of you on the line, Katrina Brooks and David Usum, you have a lot more experience with stuff like that.
If I could add real quick, in Minnesota, there are a few people who are coming to mind in terms of direct contact who also do RJ and are RJ practitioners. Or I'm thinking of one probation officer that I worked with in corrections who participated in a circle, saw the benefit of it, knew he wasn't probably the best person to be running the circles, and so invited other people in to do that. So I think this looks differently, right, depending upon the location, and that there are certainly some people who've taken that upon themselves. But I think, right, that's the difference between the grassroots people being in personally motivated to do so versus the top down, like this is the program that we're going to be doing now and everyone needs to get on board. But I think there are certainly pockets of that. And so, Michael, maybe we can connect you with some of those folks if you want to continue having that conversation, yeah, with folks who are doing that.
And Michael, let me say a little bit. We've had some webinars on this. Next week on Wednesday, we'll have another webinar at the same time with Vanessa Wesley from the Chicago PD. And she'll be talking about the work that they've been doing with police and the community around restorative justice and restorative practices. Let me just say, there are a number of places where it's growing, especially with police, and an effort to look at police as sort of first line response, and that they have a lot more discretion than we're imagining often, and that they're taught in the sense of how they decide what to do when they respond to crisis situations or calls or come into situations where there's a great deal of conflict or harm that has occurred. And so we're finding here locally in Harrisonburg, we have a restorative justice coalition that we've put together that involves schools and the police and other universities and community folk, and we're mediation centers and so on. And we're working at trying to think about what would this look like to sort of advance restorative justice in many different sectors so that it becomes common knowledge, and that the community understands this as an option in many different sectors in many different ways. We are also aware that there's a lot of work being done around police in the Boston area, police and restorative justice, the Chicago police and restorative justice work, and there are other bits and pieces around the country. We as the Zehr Institute also brought together a small group of police folk, law enforcement folk who are using restorative justice or trying to in various places. So this is a growing movement. It's very new. So we're not quite sure what it's going to look like.
Carl, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that, and it's interesting just reading this feed and thinking about questions that are coming up that maybe in retrospect I wish we had added to the listening session, was perhaps folks that are really working with systems and institutions. How are you working with them? What are the tensions that come up, right? Like Katrina has written again that you're training police as a part of the Baltimore City schools, and that you're doing this big schools project. What are the successes that are working? What are the tensions that are coming up working in a big school system, right? I know folks in Oakland had a lot to say about that. There's nothing hunky-dory about what's going on in Oakland schools. Like, if anything, there was a lot of frustration about what it means to be in a broken school system, right? So what does it mean to be really, really trying to, I talk to Sujata all the time about, you know, what does it mean to really do pre-charged restorative community conferencing diversion when you're coming up against justice systems that don't want to do that. So that feels like a very, very big conversation that, you know, I'm hoping as this moves forward, that's almost like a bucket area that we can add to folks that are in law enforcement, that are in schools, that are really, you know, working in that sort of systemic way with RJ to kind of have these learning conversations from each other. One of the things that I think that people did mention that were in systems was the sense of, you know, this wanting to not make RJ the RJ in a box thing, right? And the sense that really wanting to make sure that it's seen as a paradigm shifter and not as sort of, here's a boxed approach that just has a quick fix. And so I know that there's a little bit of tension in our own community about that, and that's something that we seem to probably need to work out.
Absolutely. Yeah, great feed that's going on here. We've heard from Sarah in the Department of, or she's commenting on the Department of Corrections here in Missouri. She says, do restorative justice, but in my opinion, it's very watered down. Gardening, dog programs, and quilting. Very neat activities that should be available to our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, however, not really RJ. And those few programs that are real, victim-offender dialogue, are so deeply underfunded that they're not truly, they have not truly operated in years. I think, you know, that's Missouri, but that's a story that we're hearing in many different places. And I don't know if we want to comment a little bit about that and how we might want to think about mitigating in those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, yes, I hear that all the time. I do a lot of work, you know, intersection with corrections, and restorative justice is the sexy word. You know, people call everything restorative justice, everything from yoga to dog programs, and it's extremely exhausting and infuriating. And I mean, just tiring, right? And so I think, you know, it feels like as something grows in its momentum, it's something that we have to keep naming and keep working with and keep pushing up against. But maybe, Sarah, you also have something to add.
From working in the Department of Corrections in Minnesota. I mean, yes. So Sarah in Missouri, I would suggest that you reach out to Alicia Nichols in the Department of Corrections in Minnesota. She is the lead coordinator there for Restorative Justice, and hopefully she doesn't mind that I just said this on this webinar. But I mean, she might have some good conversation for you about the different programming that's happening. And also, I mean, I think Minnesota has some of the same challenges in the DOC system of lots of different programs, which are fantastic, but also like what is the standards of practice that we were mentioning earlier, and what does that look like? What is that continuum? And these things that should be happening, but then also like the VOD programs, the surrogate program, like all these other RJ programs that are probably more grounded in being like victim, offender, community, and whatever words you want to use, those who have harmed, those who have been harmed, and what that looks like, and especially when funding is such a huge concern. So if you want to shoot me an email, I can give you her name and contact information if you guys want to chat at all. So.
And Sarah also mentions, Sarah from Missouri also mentions that the DOC often says, and here's the tension, we already do that. And exactly that's the point. I think that's what we're wrestling with, and we feel there's a new tide turning around this sort of sense of us becoming the net widening extension of the system, and thinking more about what does it mean to have change agents that are thinking differently and working differently within the system, and change agents working outside of the system. And part of the problem is we've always had that, but they haven't been talking to each other either. So what would it mean for us to think more seriously about the coordination of that talking together and collaboration from change agents inside and change agents outside? I think social movement theory would tell us that we have to have those folks thinking differently, acting differently, then also communicating and collaborating. Sorry about that. We've got a few more coming in here. Let me just take a look at them. There's some comment here from Darren. Thank you, from British Columbia. We believe on the policing side, he's talking about, we believe that the RJ practitioners should be from the community. We believe that we should be part of the process by referring to the programs. The issue here is the programs do not receive sustainable funding, which is something we've been hearing, yeah. And thus training is low or non-existent, which gives issues to legitimacy of the program. It's a cyclical effect. And yeah, I think we're gonna have to think about new containers for funding if we're gonna really see this work go forward. But at the same time, we also have to think creatively about how we're willing to use our time and energy and our commitment to the vision outside of just the funding we receive. Yeah, please, Sonya, as you're seeing the feed too.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because I believe Darren was in the British Columbia session. And, you know, one of the things that came up a lot was this notion that, you know, it's really, really hard to find trainings. And I've had that experience. I know my colleagues have had that experience. And to really have trainings that are much higher profile and easier to access and subsidize, that was a big thing. You know, higher profile, easier to access and subsidized. And so that was something that came out of British Columbia, as well as something that came out of Maryland is at some point, you know, after you've been practicing for a while, just taking a training, you know, you've kind of done the trainings, and taking a training, it doesn't usually fit the need that you're looking for. So there was this notion in a lot of the sessions that just the connectivity that we have in ourselves is really helpful to building a sense of what do we do next, right? So practitioners talking to practitioners, practitioners having more practice groups, just being more connected so that we can actually, when I have a problem, I want to go to somebody that knows a little bit about, has been doing this work for a while, and I know that if I just bounce some ideas through a group, a practitioner group, I'm probably going to get a lot of ideas back. So how do we even support more collaboration and coalition building and partnership building, or just even just hanging out, you know, hanging out. with the practitioners that kind of need to do some, more work and training. But yes, if we're talking about scaling up and getting big, like this whole question of training and accessibility and visibility has to be central to that.
Thank you, Sonya. Good stuff coming in here. We have Faith again commenting on restorative justice as a way of life and saying we really need to see it being taught from K to 12. I think we share that vision. I think that's a long-term vision. We have to think about restorative justice as generational thinking, that this is a kind of justice that can be passed on generationally, and it's a non-violent justice that doesn't privilege state-sanctioned violence, and therefore it's something that has sustainability, I think, for the generations to come. So many of us are in this for the long haul, thinking about what are we doing now to build for the generations to come. But I think there are a lot of voices that would join yours in saying, let's continue to see how we make this part of our culture, as well as our educational system from the get-go. Samantha Baker, a car, talking about Baltimore City Police Department. They're currently participating in youth police dialogue circles that are being facilitated by the Baltimore City Community Mediation. So that's great. I know that Chicago, and we'll probably hear some more about that if you join us in the webinar next week, are also doing youth police dialogue circles. And I think this is really important work. We have another comment here. Some of the tensions including working with systems that serve and support the same youth, but operate in silos and traditionally do not communicate across systems. Yes, getting folks to do this to the same table and getting them to speak the same language is exhausting. I think we'd all agree that this process is going to take a great deal of energy and effort, and the commitment to walk our talk is going to invite us to move into a deep commitment around this. We are extremely happy about the city school commitment, which was made by our mayor's office and the city government agencies, such as the city health department, coming together and sharing the vision. That's great. I think there's this movement around looking at how could we make cities more restorative across their sectors. I'm not sure if I want to dive into the idea of declaring a city restorative, but at least how do we make restorative infused? How do we get to see restorative justice being infused in as many sectors as possible in a city, or especially in a smaller city? It's possible. Some of the bigger cities, that seems to be a really long-term version. But thank you for working at these gaps and making sure that the youth voice and community voice stays strong and present at the decision-making table. This is another emphasis by in this comment, and we would say absolutely. That's the only way we're going to see this. The shift in power on where is the decision making, where is the locus of ownership, where is the locus of redistribution of resources, both financial and human. And we need to relocate that in many ways, recenter it at that level with the youth and the community. Those are two critical comments there. Sonya, Sarah, you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking also at the last comment that John Kuchar wrote around, relational engagement and holistic healing. And I think, in the fundamental level, we get back to like everything having to be grounded in like really, really good relationships, really healthy, trusting containers and relationships, and that sense of holistic healing, right? And that the minute that we start to get into the other stuff is when we start fading away from the intention of what we're doing. And so I feel like, as much as we can keep going back to our values and those values, whether we're working in urban settings or rural settings, the indigenous paradigm, systems and institutions, that seems to be central. Just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. And I think we all know that coalition building is not as easy as doing our own thing. But I think if we want to see this grow and have a cultural shift as a movement should, we're going to have to commit ourselves to what it means to build coalition. And sometimes our restorative justice work starts with a lot of external work so that coalition can be strengthened and trust and relationship can be built between organizations which in the past may have competed for the same funding, and think about what would it be to come together and vision together and then find the funding together. I think that's what we're going to have to see as the next wave if this movement is to be sustained. Have another comment here from Sherry Silverstein. Thank you. Another term that is also being used for everything under the sun besides RJ is trauma-informed. I'm wondering how much collaboration you see between people advocating for RJ and people advocating for trauma-informed public health solutions. Here at EJUSA, we talk about trauma-informed responses to violence, and we believe RJ is a critical component of that. We're doing dialogues with police and community in Newark, New Jersey, and we're using a trauma frame rather than an RJ frame, but we understand that it's all coming from the same analysis. Sonya?
Yeah, I have something to say to that. Hi, Sherry. I've talked to Sherry and I've talked about this before. You know, it's interesting for me. I feel like, what's our starting point, right? Like, you know, my starting point is about reducing harm on all levels, like structural, interpersonal, like increasing connection and relationship and decreasing the way we hurt each other. And within that, you know, I know that my nexus is somewhere between restorative justice, trauma healing, structural oppression, and criminal justice reform. It's kind of all of it and none of it at the same time, right? And I think what happens is we get sort of even being siloed into like being like, this is about restorative justice. It's almost like we're letting the kind of compartmental RJ, you know, the paradigm of compartmentalizing dictate how we talk about things. So I wonder what it would look like if we were to just really shift our thinking in terms of what is our starting point? Like, you know, is it reducing the way we hurt each other and increasing our relationships? Then how does trauma fit into that? How does the public health notion of trauma and trauma-informed fit in? How does restorative justice fit in? How does structural harm and oppression fit in? How does intersectionality fit in? How does all of that fit in? Because there's a constellation and combination of things that have to work together to make us actually safer, to make us actually more healed, you know, to make us actually feel more free, to have more agency, and to be in more connection. So what's our end goal? I almost wish sometimes we would start there. And in terms of, and then it leads us to the starting point and the question. And some of these boxes, like restorative justice, transformative justice, trauma-informed, blah, blah, everything. It's like, you know, we're cutting up slices that create a lot of tension. So, you know, I really want to just say, yes, Sherry, like, you know, it's so true. And these things really need to work together. And thank you for just putting it out there like that.
Right. And I think there's great overlap in the trauma field and psychosocial support and restorative justice. And yeah, we can separate out the frames. I think they complement each other. I think they are separate, though. I don't want to collapse them into one big conglomerate of stuff, but I think they are very complementary, and I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations across these disciplines.
I would add quickly that when we were asking people to describe their processes and practices, trauma healing was something that ranked very high with the RJ folks who were responding to that. So I'm not sure how that might translate into advocacy on the topics, but I think there is certainly right, an intersection of that work. And just a brief sharing, I have a colleague here who has traditionally been more in the trauma field, and she's going through her first RJ process, and we were chatting about that, and she was like, even the prep work feels like it's trauma healing. Like I feel better even just having someone hear me, because the RJ practitioner who's facilitating this is actually invested in listening to me. So right, I think we're talking about different levels here, and this is a bit more micro, but I think we are seeing some of those intersections in people, you know, from either side of the line being like, oh yeah, we're both, this is connected when we're doing all this work together.
Fantastic. Well, we're nearing the end of this time, and I really appreciate the rich and textured comments and questions that have been coming through. I just want to, there was Sarah from Missouri also put out, it reminded us that Michael at Longmont Community Center, Justice Center is working directly with police And you can see more about their work at www.icjp.org. That's Longmont Community Justice Center in Colorado. So for those who might be interested, you can take a look at that online. Are there any other comments, Sonya and Sarah, you would like to make as we start to wrap up our time here and turn it back over to Kajungu soon?
Sonya, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
No, I just thank you for folks for attending the webinar and for listening. And again, thank you to all those people who were able to participate in the listening sessions themselves. And there were a lot of, I think we've already said, like, there's no way that we could get to everybody in the amount of time that we had. So this is just kind of the first step in this. And so we're very thankful for those who could participate and hoping to hear from those other voices as well in the future. So it's been a really rich experience, and we have a lot more unpacking and distilling and all of those things to do. So thank you, all of you.
Yeah, same thing. Just want to thank everyone, and it's been an incredibly humbling, beautiful process, and definitely walked away learning more than giving. So really appreciate that. Thanks.
There is a last comment here I'm going to read. I'm grateful to be able to join you all. This comes from George Babaeng. I apologize for coming on late. I am Babaeng and I'm in Buffalo, New York. When I came online, I heard the comment that RJ is a way of life. That is where I am at, and one of the first things I had to do and continue to do is deconstruct the paradigm that I grew up in my own head, and then begin to encourage others to do the same thing. For me, it is about how we view ourselves and therefore how we view the world and other people. It actually, for me, begins with how you see yourself and then begin to adjust your view based on how you heal your own damage. And we have all been damaged by the systems that we grew up in. So when we talk about trauma-informed work, that analysis fits into everything because we have all been traumatized. I see you are closing up, so I look to join you the next time. Peace. Thank you, George. That's a great comment at the end there. And I just want to say thank you. There's a number of folks who internally commented on feeling like this is helping us feel a bit more connected across the work of RJ in this nation and in North America. So thank you. That is our aim. And there'll be more time to talk about this in various settings and in various platforms. So we want to say appreciation to all who joined us today for this conversation. Kajungu, over to you.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Kajungu Samson Mtori, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peace Building in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I work as a graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I have a couple announcements to share with you all. First, upcoming webinar. The Spring of 2017 webinar series was recently finalized, and its theme will be Building Bridge from Margins to Center. Each webinar will feed into the theme of the June 2017 National Conference on Community and Restorative Justice. As in the past, all webinars will take place on Wednesday from 4:30 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming webinar will be April 26. It will be focused on a community justice partnership, and it will be hosted by Stauffer. Again, we have webinar coming. It's called Law Enforcement Through Restorative Justice, Peace Building in the Community. And this is six-part course from June 28 to August 2nd. It will be a weekly basis. Is an introduction to restorative justice with emphasis on its applications in law enforcement. Participants will explore innovative ways to incorporate restorative justice within an agency and to collaborate with community organizations on such initiatives. Through presentations and interactive discussions, example of implementation in police agencies throughout the United States will be shown case. Some of these will be include an alternatives to or within the criminal justice system, citizen complaints, internal conflict, and a community engagement. And by the facilitators are very qualified police officers by professional. They've been practice restorative justice while they're working in their career. So I would recommend to apply. Please visit our website down there for registration and more information. It's not too late to sign up for the Center for Justice and Peace Building Summer Peace Building Institute for 2017. SPI is 4 weeks intensive during May and June, offering 20 different courses. If you're interested in taking an intensive course or restorative justice, here are 3 of the options available during the curriculum. All of these course options are available online. We have another online course. It's called Restorative Justice. Start August 29 to December 15, 2017. And the instructor of this course will be Johan Chun. This course provides a critical examination of the values, principles, and the practice of restorative justice. So it's online course you can take while you are still working with your regular work. Please visit this website down there or email direct to that email provided down there on the slide. Strategic for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR, is a research-based training program that brings together theory and practice from neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, spirituality, and restorative justice to address the needs of trauma-impacted individuals and the communities. This program is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current and historical trauma. There are several opportunities to receive STAR training. Currently, there are four. Level 1 session will be provided in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and a level 2 training at EMU here, Virginia. If you're interested in participating or have any question, more information can be found online. Graduate Certificate in Restorative Justice. This certificate is 18 credit hours with equal focus given to conflict analysis and the practices. Restorative justice studies and elective, which could focus on monitoring and evaluation, psychological trauma, and etc. The certificate can be completed through a number of courses offered through the annual Summer Peace Building Institute or through a combination of 1 semester on campus and one during the summer term. Restorative justice in education. If you're interested in the intersection of restorative justice and education, there's a master's in education with restorative justice concentration. This is 15 hours graduate certificate in restorative justice in education, and it can be used by a variety of professionals working in education setting. There's also a master's degree in conflict transformation, and along with that, this fall marks the beginning of Center for Justice and Peace Building offering a master's degree in restorative justice. The curriculum is a practice based on ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners with their chosen field. Lastly, but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, the schedule of upcoming webinars, and a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. That concludes my announcement. So here's Carla with a few closing comments.
Thank you all who have stayed on and joined us, and we wish you all the best, and hoping that we will continue this conversation and that you will be back with us for the subsequent webinars coming up. Thank you and have a good evening, and thank you to Sonya and Sarah for your time and your expertise, and we hope the conversation continues. Go as you work for justice, and may you continue to expand the work that you do. Thank you.